Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and earlier this week I watched the new film, The Report. Now, I want to say the new film, but it's actually a 2019 movie, and I don't know whether in other parts of the world this movie has already been released prior, but here in New Zealand, this Amazon original film, The Report, has only just been released on Amazon Prime here in New Zealand. Other parts of the world, you may have had access to it for months or since last year, I don't know, but here it's a new thing. So forgive me if you've already seen it months ago and you're thinking, what's this guy talking about? This ain't new. Yeah, it is in this part of the world. And little Hicksville down here at the bottom of the world, it's kind of new. The Report, for those who don't know, is this 2019 film starring Adam Driver as Daniel Day-Lewis. No, he's not Daniel Day-Lewis. Daniel J. Jones, who is a Senate staffer. Annette Bening, who plays Senator Dianne Feinstein. I'm not sure exactly what's the correct way of saying that. Someone tell me in the comment section. And John Hamm, who plays Dennis McDonough, who was the White House Chief of Staff under Obama. For those who don't know anything about this movie, this is a film about, it's kind of about two things, but it's about more than that. And that's why I wanted to talk about this today, because I think this is actually a really important time for this film to come out, and it's got some really important themes around US politics and some big implications that sort of cross the partisan divide, if you like. So for those who don't know much about this film, it's about, first of all, it's about the torture program that the United States ran post 9/11 to try and weed out information about and to stop terrorist attacks happening. So after 9/11, obviously, there's an awareness that how vulnerable the US really is. And so, there's a desperation, if you like, to try and ensure that those sorts of things don't ever happen again. And what you really get from this film is the sense that they were willing to give anything a go. We'll talk more about that in a minute, to actually try and get the job done, including this torture program that they ran. But the film is not really just about the torture program. So it gives you the basic details of how it unfolded and what was going on. More importantly, though, this film really does focus in on what happened next, which is under the Obama regime. And that's when there's this Senate investigation into the torture program, and a report is written detailing all of this program and what happened, and laying bare all of the really horrific details about this very serious violation of human rights that was perpetrated by the United States. And what the film focuses on is the fact that this report, attempts were made actively to suppress that report and to prevent it from being made available to the public. As far as the film goes, I think this is a pretty good thriller. It's a dramatic thriller. It's more procedural than sort of shock and tension, but it's still, for me anyway, I found myself engaged. It wasn't like I ever switched off or got bored at any point, despite the fact that it's not really like any major shock twists and turns in this. It just, as I said, it follows the procedural line, and it really is just unraveling what happened. But it does it in such a way that it's well told. Everything that goes on screen should be on screen to keep your attention and keep the plot moving. It's not like groundbreaking, it's not Oscar winning or anything like that, but this is a good, solid little thriller. But more importantly, and this is why I wanted to make the video about this film, there are some things that struck me as really, really important about this movie. So for me, it's not really about the technical aspects of the film, like the directing, the producing, and the acting. They're all very serviceable things. Instead, there are three things that really struck me as quite important and certainly piqued my interest about this film. Number one is how balanced this movie actually is. Now, the torture program, and the movie's very clear about this, began under the George Bush presidency. But here's the interesting thing. He's not told about this, and the movie tells us this. He's not told about the fact that this torture program is actually running under his regime, and has been running, I think, for about 4 years at that stage. He's not told until 2006 that they've been doing this in his name and during his presidency. I'll come back to that in a minute, because I think that's kind of important. It points to, and it talks to something else that I think was certainly piqued my interest about this movie. But it's very balanced in the way that it actually just puts all the facts on the table. It doesn't try and say, well, one side was better than the other, because what it then goes on to do after that is it points out, yeah, this started under the Bush regime. But then they also point out that even though Obama actually stopped the torture program, he then actively refused to investigate, and also he colluded with the CIA to try and keep the report findings about the torture program secret. He did this for his own political expediency. And this is quite astounding when you consider this. You realize what you've got here is you've got a president who you could say is responsible for not ensuring that these sort of humanitarian abuses are not happening under his regime. And then you've got another president who comes after him, who basically allows the secrecy to be maintained and people not to be held accountable for what are very, very serious human rights violations. There's an interesting scene in the film where there's a phone call to the White House, to Obama, and he refuses, the White House just refuses flat out to take action. And afterwards we are told the reason that he's doing that is because the CIA effectively just handed him re-election, the whole Osama bin Laden assassination thing. And so the film was very balanced. I thought that was interesting because I went into it with eyes wide open. I thought, I wonder if this is going to be quite political. A lot of films now are very politically motivated. You know, for example, if you go into a Greengrass film, you know that you're going to get a very politically pointed film. And it's going to point in one direction and it's going to be trying to make a statement. This film, it's really not trying to do that. It's actually, the statement it's trying to make is about the torture and about the attempted cover-up. It's not really interested in what your politics are, and I thought that was kind of refreshing, and it really stuck out to me as an important aspect of this film. The second thing about this movie that I found really interesting is the fact that I think it speaks to something that people often refer to as the deep state, and there's also the issue of scientism at play here. First of all, let me deal with the deep state thing. Whenever you hear people throwing around the term the deep state, it can be very tempting to think that they're just baseless conspiracy theories, and it's this sort of crazy idea about some secret group of people who are meeting, you know, in private to plot out the next 4 years or 8 years or 20 years or 100 years of world history, you know, the masters of the universe type stuff. In actual fact, I've never thought of the deep state in that kind of way. I've always thought of the deep state as what I think it really is, which is effectively bureaucrats, bureaucratic organizations, and bureaucratic mechanisms that exist behind the public front of government, which is your elected officials, you know, your president or your prime minister, depending on which country you're in. And this bureaucratic layer and this bureaucratic sort of blob or sort of hard to pin down type machine, if you like, actually wields a lot of power, and at times really wields far too much power and has far too much unaccountable power. It's really about people who have a lot of power with very little sunlight on them. And you see this in the way the film handles John Brennan, who was the director of the CIA under Obama. And it's interesting because, like I said, remember before I talked about the fact that George Bush only found out about the program in 2006. That's quite astounding when you think about it. You're the president, and a very, very serious military operation involving capturing and torturing suspected terrorists and those involved in terror is launched under your presidency, and you don't know a thing about it until about 4 years after it started, and with only 2 years left to go in your final term in office. That is astounding that can happen, and that speaks to the fact that you have got a machine, if you like, that exists within the halls of power that has far too much power and far too little accountability if that sort of thing can actually start happening without a president even knowing about it. What's interesting is they talk about the fact that when Bush was made aware of the torture program, he said apparently that he was uncomfortable by it. Now, they don't go into any more details than that. I personally think George Bush should have stopped the program, but I'm also willing to accept, based on the facts that are put forward by this film, that they may not have told George Bush the full truth about exactly what they were doing. In fact, I suspect they probably gave him a very sanitized version of events. I think it's probably highly likely that Rumsfeld and Cheney and guys like that, they knew what was going on, but whether they told Bush the full story, even when they told him in 2006, I mean, I don't know enough about this. Perhaps others in the comment section can let me know whether or not there's more information out there about what Bush actually was told and what we know. I think personally he should have stopped it, but I can understand why, if he wasn't told the full truth, he may not have grasped just how serious this was. And the reason I say that is because I remember watching a video years ago with Bono talking about George Bush, and Bono is no friend of the Republican Party, not even close. But Bono is sitting there in this public interview, and he's done it more than once, praising George Bush as being the most effective president for humanitarian aid in Africa. And he's saying he did more for Africa than any other president before, and he even highlighted that he did more than Obama did for humanitarian causes in Africa. And it's kind of hard to believe that a president who has that kind of humanitarian focus is just going to switch that off if you start telling him the full, true, gory details about what was entailed in this torture program. And so I'm kind of questioning whether he was actually told the whole truth. He may have been. Either way, I think it should have been stopped. But the point is it wasn't. It carried on for another couple of years. Obama takes office, but then what you have is Obama actively colluding with the CIA. So when he first takes office, he stops the program, but then he's told by this group of experts, and the film points out that even Hillary Clinton was involved in this, they're told you need to have an independent inquiry, an independent investigation needs to be launched, and people need to be held accountable for this. And he refuses to do that. He refuses to do that because he thinks, and I think this is just so wrong-headed to me, the film suggests that the reason he chose not to have that independent investigation was because he had sold himself as being this sort of this bipartisan president, and so he thought it would have been this partisan thing to be seen to be going after your enemies. To me, that's just astounding. Like that you would consider what is very, very credible information about very serious violations of human rights, that you say, oh, well, it's more important that I look to be honouring my promise than we actually investigate and bring justice for the victims of these crimes. That, to me, that's just astounding. He chose political expediency. But it gets worse because after that, when this reporters commission and the report starts discovering all of this, horrific information, all the gory details are put together, and there's a summary that they want to release publicly, Obama is actively colluding. The White House is colluding with the CIA to actually try and thwart the attempts of this Senate Investigation Committee to release that information. And there is even a point at which the CIA effectively breaks the law, and they show this in the film. They go into this room that they're not supposed to be in, the investigation room where no one's there, and they start trolling through the computers and through all of the data they've got, so that effectively they hacked this committee to find out more, and so in an attempt to try and thwart the release of this. This is quite astounding. This is, again, this whole idea of this deep state, this group of people who have so much power and so little accountability that they feel confident violating, the separation of government powers principle, and they feel so confident in doing that and acting against, the Senate, and doing this illegal thing, that there's just going to be no repercussions for them. They feel that confident in doing it. It's quite astounding, really. And Obama's White House is part of this sort of collusion. He's actually wants to try and suppress the release of this information. And it's only, the film depicts the scene where they go into a Democrat caucus, and it's only when some of the senators in that caucus meeting threaten to actually just publicly start reading out the findings from the Senate floor that anything changes. It's quite astounding that could even happen, and it's quite frightening. It points to this mechanism that exists underneath government, and the film really sort of focuses on that, and it's very balanced in that. It really shows you that there is a bureaucracy that wields a lot of power that crosses regimes in the United States. It's not just about one regime or another, it crosses regimes. The other thing is the point around scientism, which is interesting in this film. And what I mean by that is the fact that here are these two scientists who sold the torture program to the United States government, and it's this program that's actually, there's really no basis to believe what they're saying. There's no substantive basis. But what happens is, because they're scientists and they're claiming they have scientific authority, and therefore you should believe us and do what we say because we're scientists and we know what we're talking about, they went along with this. And even when the evidence is plain to see that this torture program is not actually working. So the most important issue here obviously is the moral issue. It is immoral to do what they did. But even if you don't accept that moral belief and you reject that moral truth that you shouldn't torture people, and you're a utilitarian and you say, well, look, if we torture people and they give us good information and it stops a terrorist attack, then I'm okay with torturing people. Even if that's your view, you're very utilitarian in your moral ideology. That still doesn't justify this program because it didn't produce any utility. The program did not produce results. And yet, despite the fact that this is clearly evident in the program, and they've had previous attempts at using torture in the history of the US that have not worked, they just carry on with this program. It's quite astounding that this carried on for about 6 years or so before it was stopped. And it really speaks to this issue of scientism, which is sort of one of the plagues, I would argue, of our day. This idea that you defer all authority to those who have some sort of scientific qualification, and you never question, and you're not allowed to question. And the film, it doesn't really hammer this point, but there's several scenes where you really see this playing out in a very practical, real-world way, where people start to question things, but then the whole science thing is thrown back in their face, and they just back off, or they're willing to just say, okay, is this actually true? Oh, you're a scientist, it must be true. Is there science to back this up? Yeah, it's all good, it's all good. And they're like, well, the scientists are saying it's all good, it must be all good. It's quite astounding when you actually think about this and what went on and how they were able to perpetrate it for so long, when clearly all the evidence was pointing to the fact that this should not have been happening at all, either morally or from a utilitarian perspective. The third and final thing that really struck me about this film is I think it's actually really timely. It's a very important and I think timely film. Why do I say that? Well, for all of the reasons I've mentioned above, plus the fact that Joe Biden was the vice president of the very regime that actively tried to cover this up, that actively decided more than once that they did not want an investigation, that they did not want publicly the information about this very serious and grave human rights violation to be released. And it's I think nonsensical to suggest that Joe Biden had no hand in that. He had no awareness of this. He's not mentioned at all in this film, and I get that. It's not really like they mention lots of people within the regime. It's a very sort of focused thriller. But it's absolutely naive, I think, to believe that Biden had no awareness and no hand in this. And the reason I say that is because there's been a lot of coverage lately in the last couple of days since the unfolding of the American election, where various commentators have been talking about the fact that, Kamala Harris, if the final election result goes that way and she is the vice president, she will be very much an involved and very involved vice president, not just a token sort of figurehead. And a lot of commentators have made the comparison to Joe Biden, saying he was a very involved vice president. He wasn't simply a figurehead. He was very intimately involved in the Obama regime. So it's interesting to me that this movie, well, it's certainly in New Zealand here, it's come out around this time, and it's certainly, for me, raised some even more questions. Aside from the fact that I've seen a lot of coverage and articles lately from neocon type think tanks and others, academics who are saying that they are praising Biden because they think that, unlike Trump, he'll be a stronger hand in the Middle East. And they're excited about effectively the fact that he's willing, and that they're claiming he will be willing to use military force, US military force again in the United States and embroil the US in these sort of affairs in the Middle East. And so, it's hard to believe that, that he's not involved in this, and that this is not going to have implications, that this film doesn't effectively point to some important details that might be worth knowing and considering in relation to what's ahead if the final results show that, there is a Biden presidency. The other thing that's interesting about this movie is that it also references Obama's drone assassination program, chunks of which were carried out in secret. Now, that's a whole other thing. The film doesn't labour that point, but there's a couple of scenes where they make very clear and direct reference to the fact that this is going on, that the CIA is involved in the secret drone assassination program, and also, more importantly, that they are killing innocent civilians with this drone assassination program. And I think that was it's an important detail. I really think when people look back on presidencies, there's a tendency to do that with a very jaundiced view. I think probably for me the clearest example of this would be the JFK presidency. People have a very idealized vision of what they think JFK was and what he did. The truth is a lot more complex, and there's some pretty dark moments embroiled in all of that. Now, Obama very much gets that same sort of treatment, I think. Not as much as the whole Camelot mythology and stuff around the Kennedys, but certainly there's a very favourable looking back on that presidency that tends to ignore some of the stuff. And so I think it's important that films like this are made that just put all of these important details on the table. It's also interesting, I think, when you think about the relationship. Speaking of the Joe Biden issue, you think about the relationship between Biden and Dick Cheney. Now, Dick Cheney is very, very involved in pulling the levers behind the Bush presidency, including around this torture program that this film is focusing on. Biden and Cheney have a close friendship. There was a CNN report the other day, or someone on CNN suggesting that Biden could well even use Dick Cheney as a foreign policy advisor during his presidency, which I find quite astounding. But then I think, well, it's quite possible because, as I said, you've had these neocons who have been praising Biden in the last few weeks, and also Biden has publicly stated, back in, was it 2015, he publicly stated that he had a great respect for Dick Cheney, and that Dick Cheney really taught him a lot and tutored him about how to be a vice president and what the legal boundaries, quote unquote, which is quite frightening when you think about it. He's talking about Dick Cheney advising him about the legal boundaries of the vice presidency. If you want to know more about that, I'd encourage you to watch the film Vice. I don't know if it's very flattering, but it certainly raises some big questions around the question of the legal boundaries of the office of vice president, and also Cheney around that time. And I think on a couple of previous occasions as well, actually advised and said that publicly said that Biden should run as the Democrat candidate to try and win the presidency. I think he did it against Clinton as well. In the comment section, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you know more about that, please let me know. But I think that this movie has sort of important details that really speak to, even though Biden is not the subject of this, he's not mentioned, there's no doubt there's a very intimate association here that I think is worth noting, because if the final result is that we're in a Biden presidency, and if you're watching this movie review right here many months from now, it might actually be that that is the case. I think it's something worth being aware of, because one of my suspicions is that with a Biden presidency, there will be a return of the establishment, and the establishment, I think, includes the likes of that military involvement, that very, very questionable, at best, I would argue, military interventions in the United States and in other countries. And I think it will be a return to that. It will also be a return, I think, to that kind of establishment where the bureaucracies and the bureaucratic machines that are very much a focus of this film will feel very comfortable in operating. It's a return to a very, very questionable status quo. A lot of people are trying to sell this as a bright new dawn, a new way. I really don't believe that for a second, for a couple of reasons. One is power has a very funny way of corrupting people, but also because of the fact that you're talking about a guy and a machine, that helped to get him elected, and a party mechanism, and Biden himself, who's very much comes from that establishment. It's just highly questionable to me that he would ever know anything else but the establishment way of doing things, and would ever have the will to actually change that in any meaningful way. So it will be fascinating to see how things unfold, or have unfolded if you're watching this many months from now. Let's wait and see what happens. You guys are awesome. Thanks for tuning in. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Have you seen the film The Report? If you haven't, I highly recommend it. If you have, let me know what you think in the comment section below. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media. Thanks for watching this video. If you're not already a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button, and don't forget to hit that little notifications bell as well. If you enjoyed this content, then please support the channel. You can do that using the PayPal link below. If you want to make a one-off contribution because you enjoyed this particular video, you can do that using the PayPal link in the video description. There's also a PayPal link found at the top of my YouTube homepage. Alternately, you can become a regular patron by supporting the channel with a regular contribution on Patreon. That's patreon.com/leftfootmedia. As little as $1 a month is all it takes, or as much as you'd like to give. A huge thank you to everyone who is supporting this channel. Without you, today's video would not have been possible. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.